The rain had already flooded half the driveway by the time the black SUV appeared through the fog. For a moment, nobody inside the Whitmore mansion moved. The elderly housekeeper standing near the front window thought she was imagining things. The groundskeeper outside, near the fountain, froze with his flashlight still pointed toward the gate. Even the security guards exchanged nervous looks because the woman stepping out of that vehicle was someone they never expected to see again. 20 years earlier, Evelyn had walked through those same gates carrying a crying little boy in one arm and a worn suitcase in the other, while members of the Whitmore family stood behind her like strangers watching someone disappear forever. They had stripped her of her dignity, erased her photographs from the walls, changed the locks before sunrise, and spread rumors across Manhattan that she had been unstable, manipulative, and dangerous. By morning, her name had vanished from every conversation connected to the Whitmore empire. But on this night, with thunder rolling above the estate and rain striking the marble steps, Evelyn returned to the mansion they once forced her to leave. Only this time, the mansion belonged to her. For years, people across New York whispered about what happened inside that estate after the death of Alexander Whitmore. Some believed Evelyn was responsible for his downfall. Others claimed the Whitmore family framed her to protect their fortune. Nobody ever agreed on the truth because every person connected to that night told a different story. Former servants disappeared without explanation. Lawyers handling the Whitmore estate suddenly resigned. Private investigators hired by journalists refused to speak publicly after visiting the mansion. Even more disturbing was the fact that several official documents connected to Alexander Whitmore's death were quietly sealed by the court within weeks. Wealth has a way of burying uncomfortable truths in America, especially when powerful families control politicians, banks, newspapers, and entire neighborhoods. The Whitmores were not simply rich people living in a beautiful home. They were one of those old money dynasties whose influence reached into places ordinary people could never see. And Evelyn had once been trapped inside that world. What nobody understood was why she chose to come back after all these years. She had disappeared so completely that many assumed she was dead. There were rumors she moved overseas. Some claimed she spent years working under different identities. Others believed she had secretly built her own financial empire somewhere far away from New York while raising her son in silence. Yet none of those stories explained the expression on her face when she stepped out of that SUV and stared directly at the mansion doors. It was not revenge people saw in her eyes that night. It was something far more unsettling. It looked like grief mixed with certainty, like a woman finally arriving at the exact moment she had been waiting for her entire life. And the strangest part was this. Before Evelyn even reached the front steps, several members of the Whitmore family were already inside arguing over a sealed envelope discovered earlier that evening in Alexander Whitmore's old private office. An envelope that was never supposed to exist. The Whitmore mansion sat on nearly 12 acres overlooking the Hudson River, hidden behind iron gates and surrounded by trees so tall they blocked almost every view from the road. Inside were 40 rooms filled with oil paintings, imported marble, antique chandeliers, and enough history to make visitors feel uncomfortable the moment they walked through the entrance hall. The family built their fortune through shipping, real estate, and political connections stretching back generations. To the outside world, they represented the image of American success people admired from a distance. Elegant charity galas, newspaper features, interviews about legacy and family values. But former employees later described the mansion very differently. They spoke about strict rules, emotional control, humiliation during family dinners, and an atmosphere where every conversation felt calculated. According to one former chauffeur, people inside the Whitmore family smiled with their mouths while preparing to destroy each other behind closed doors. And somehow, Evelyn entered that world believing love would protect her. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Long before she became the woman standing outside those gates in the rain, Evelyn was just a waitress working evening shifts at a small restaurant in downtown Manhattan. She came from a working-class neighborhood in Pennsylvania, and moved to New York carrying the same dream thousands of Americans carry every year. She wanted a better life. Friends described her as quiet, intelligent, and deeply independent. She worked double shifts, attended community college classes during the day, and sent part of every paycheck back home to help her mother pay medical bills. Alexander Whitmore met her during a private dinner arranged by one of his business partners. At the time, he was already known in financial circles as the future heir to the Whitmore empire. Educated, charming, polished, and born into wealth most people could not imagine. According to people who knew them, Alexander became fascinated by Evelyn almost immediately because she treated him like a normal person. She did not care about his last name. She argued with him openly. She laughed at him when he acted entitled. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore looked genuinely happy. But happiness inside powerful families often comes with conditions. Alexander's mother, Margaret Whitmore, reportedly opposed the relationship from the beginning. She believed Evelyn lacked the background, education, and social status necessary to join the family. Former staff members later claimed Margaret referred to Evelyn as temporary company instead of Alexander's girlfriend. Invitations to family events mysteriously stopped arriving whenever Evelyn was involved. Relatives ignored her during dinners. One former maid claimed Evelyn once spent nearly an hour alone in a ballroom bathroom after overhearing members of the family mocking the dress she wore to a charity event. Yet despite everything, Alexander married her anyway. Newspapers called it a surprising love story between old money and ordinary America. Cameras captured smiling photographs outside the church. Commentators praised Evelyn for bringing warmth into the Whitmore image. But according to insiders, the tension inside the mansion became unbearable almost immediately after the wedding. And within 2 years, something happened that changed the entire family forever. On the night Evelyn returned to the mansion, many people believed the story was finally about revenge. They assumed she came back to humiliate the family that once destroyed her. But they were wrong. Because hidden somewhere inside that mansion was a truth connected to Alexander Whitmore's death. A truth so devastating that several people had spent 20 years making sure it never reached the public. And Evelyn had finally come back to uncover it. What happened next would destroy the Whitmore family forever. To the outside world, the Whitmore family looked untouchable. Old money, political influence, generational wealth that stretched across decades and controlled more than just businesses in New York. They controlled reputations, access, and even silence. From charity galas to private boardrooms, the Whitmores presented themselves as a symbol of American success that could not be questioned. Alexander Whitmore was the golden heir, the man expected to carry the family legacy forward, polished, respected, and carefully shaped by generations that came before him. But inside the mansion where the family lived, the image they showed the world began to crack in ways nobody outside could see. Behind those walls, the Whitmore name carried weight that turned conversations into warnings. Servants spoke in low voices, careful not to be heard. Family dinners were not moments of connection, but quiet battlegrounds where every word was measured. Even smiles felt controlled, as if everyone was performing roles written long before they were born. And into this world stepped Evelyn, a woman the family never intended to accept. From the very beginning, the family never truly saw Evelyn as one of their own. Invitations felt conditional, conversations felt rehearsed, and approval was never given freely. Even after her marriage to Alexander Whitmore, she remained on the edge of every gathering, never fully included, never fully respected. There were moments where she believed things might improve, especially in the early days when Alexander seemed determined to protect her from his family's judgment. But that protection slowly weakened under pressure she could not always see. The closer she got to the Whitmore world, the more she realized it was built on expectations that left little room for someone like her. What made everything more complicated was Alexander himself. Did he truly love Evelyn in a way that could survive the weight of his family's control, or was he also trapped in a role he never chose? People who knew them described moments of real affection between them, moments that seemed genuine and unforced. But they also described long silences, sudden distance, and conversations that ended too quickly whenever certain family members entered the room. Evelyn often found herself questioning not just the family around her, but the changes she began to notice in Alexander Whitmore after their marriage. And then came the question that changed everything. Was Alexander Whitmore's death really an accident, as the official report claimed, or was it something carefully arranged and hidden behind paperwork, influence, and time? The Whitmore family insisted it was a tragic incident, something unfortunate but final. Yet Evelyn never fully accepted that version of events, not after what she saw in the days leading up to his death, not after the conversations she was never meant to overhear inside the mansion. The most painful question of all was why the family moved so quickly after the funeral. Why Evelyn was pushed out of the mansion almost immediately, stripped of her place, her access, and her connection to everything she once believed she had built a life around. There was no mourning period that included her, no space for questions, only distance enforced with cold precision. It was as if her presence had become something they needed to erase completely before it could cause further damage. And still, one question lingered beneath everything else. What exactly did Evelyn discover inside that mansion before she left? Something so serious that it changed the way the entire Whitmore family treated her overnight. Because according to one former servant who worked in the mansion for nearly 15 years, Evelyn didn't leave willingly. Long before Evelyn became the woman standing outside the Whitmore mansion in the rain, she was simply a young waitress trying to survive in New York City. She worked evening shifts at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan where businessmen, politicians, and wealthy investors regularly held private dinners behind closed curtains, while ordinary workers rushed between tables carrying plates they could never afford themselves. Evelyn was not the loudest person in the room. She did not chase attention or try to impress people. Friends described her as calm, observant, and deeply compassionate, the kind of person who remembered small details about people even when nobody noticed her at all. She spent most of her days balancing college classes, late-night shifts, and overdue bills while still sending money back home to help her mother in Pennsylvania. Life had taught Evelyn to expect struggle, not miracles. Then one evening, Alexander Whitmore walked into the restaurant and changed the direction of her life completely. Alexander was already well known in elite New York circles before he met Evelyn. As the future heir to the Whitmore empire, his life had been carefully planned since childhood. He attended private schools, moved through rooms filled with politicians and investors, and carried the quiet pressure of a last name that came with enormous expectations. But according to people who knew him closely, Alexander often looked exhausted by the life built around him. Wealth gave him access to everything except peace. When he first noticed Evelyn serving tables during one of his business dinners, it was not simply attraction that pulled him toward her. It was the fact that she spoke to him without fear, without pretending to admire him because of his money. She treated him like an ordinary person. That alone made her different from almost everyone else in his world. Their relationship developed slowly at first. Alexander began returning to the restaurant regularly, finding excuses to stay longer after meetings ended. He asked Evelyn questions nobody else had ever asked her before. What she wanted from life. What scared her. What kind of future she imagined for herself. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt truly seen. Not judged for her background. Not measured by money. Not overlooked. She later told one close friend that Alexander made her feel safe in a city where she had spent years feeling invisible. Soon they were walking through quiet Manhattan streets after midnight dinners, sitting together in small jazz clubs hidden downtown, exchanging handwritten letters whenever Alexander traveled for work. The relationship felt genuine in a way neither of them expected. But the moment the Whitmore family discovered how serious the relationship had become, everything changed. At first, the humiliation came quietly, disguised as politeness. Margaret Whitmore, Alexander's mother, greeted Evelyn with smiles that never reached her eyes. Comments about Evelyn's clothing, education, and upbringing slipped casually into conversations during dinners. Family gatherings suddenly became uncomfortable performances where Evelyn felt constantly evaluated. Invitations disappeared without explanation. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. One former servant later claimed Margaret Whitmore would intentionally arrange seating during parties to isolate Evelyn from important guests, treating her more like hired staff than the woman Alexander planned to marry. Even after the wedding, the atmosphere inside the mansion only became colder. Margaret Whitmore reportedly believed Evelyn had trapped Alexander into marriage for money and status, a belief she repeated often enough that other family members began treating it as fact. According to former employees, Margaret monitored nearly everything inside the mansion, from financial decisions to private conversations between family members. Nothing happened without her influence reaching it eventually. And slowly, Alexander Whitmore began changing in ways Evelyn could not fully understand. The man who once stayed awake talking to her for hours became quieter, distracted, more cautious with his words. Business meetings kept him away longer than before. Phone calls ended abruptly whenever Evelyn entered the room. Some nights, he looked genuinely frightened, though he never explained why. Evelyn tried convincing herself the pressure of running the Whitmore empire was simply overwhelming him. But deep down, she sensed something else was happening inside the family. Questions began growing in her mind that she could no longer ignore. Was Alexander being pressured by his family behind closed doors? Was someone controlling decisions he appeared too afraid to challenge openly? Inside the mansion, Evelyn's isolation became impossible to ignore. She often ate dinner alone while the rest of the family attended private gatherings downstairs. Hallways that once felt luxurious now felt empty and suffocating. Relatives whispered when she passed by. Doors closed the moment she approached certain rooms. Even staff members who once treated her warmly became nervous speaking to her for too long. The mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place waiting for something terrible to happen. Then everything shifted again the moment Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. For a brief moment, she believed the news might finally heal the fractures inside the family. She imagined Alexander smiling again. She imagined the possibility of unity, of a future no longer defined by tension and suspicion. But when the Whitmore family learned about the pregnancy, their reaction was nothing close to joy. According to one former employee, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed immediately after the announcement. Meetings were held behind closed doors late into the night. Margaret Whitmore reportedly stopped speaking to Evelyn directly altogether. Even Alexander appeared shaken in ways Evelyn had never seen before. At first, Evelyn could not understand why the family seemed terrified by the idea of her child being born. Then she uncovered something that explained everything. Because the baby threatened to change who inherited the Whitmore fortune. The night everything changed began with rain. Not the soft kind that disappears after a few minutes, but the kind that turns highways dangerous and leaves entire cities buried under darkness and reflection. Alexander Whitmore had left the mansion shortly after midnight following what several staff members later described as one of the most intense arguments ever heard inside the estate. Nobody knew exactly what was said behind the closed doors of his private office that evening, but multiple people confirmed voices were raised loud enough to echo through the hallway. One servant later claimed Evelyn was crying when she left the room. Another claimed Alexander looked visibly shaken afterward, pacing near the fireplace while repeatedly checking documents spread across his desk. What nobody understood at the time was that less than 3 weeks earlier, Alexander Whitmore had secretly changed his will. And according to court records discovered years later, nobody in the Whitmore family knew. That single detail would eventually become one of the most disturbing parts of the entire story, because the new will dramatically altered the future of the Whitmore fortune. If anything happened to Alexander, major portions of the family estate would no longer remain under traditional Whitmore control. Instead, ownership would pass directly to Evelyn and their unborn child. For generations, the Whitmore empire had operated under strict expectations about inheritance and power. Wealth stayed within carefully controlled bloodlines, and decisions were rarely made without family approval. Alexander's private decision threatened that entire structure. And only days after signing those documents, he died on a rain-soaked highway just outside Manhattan. Official reports stated Alexander Whitmore lost control of his vehicle during severe weather conditions. Police photographs showed the remains of a black luxury sedan crushed against a highway barrier, while emergency lights reflected across flooded pavement. Newspapers described it as a tragic accident involving speed and poor visibility. Television stations replayed helicopter footage of the wreck for days, while reporters gathered outside the Whitmore mansion, waiting for statements from the grieving family. To the public, the story appeared heartbreaking but simple. A wealthy heir dies unexpectedly, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a devastated family. But almost immediately, details surrounding the accident began raising uncomfortable questions. According to transportation records later reviewed by private investigators, Alexander's vehicle had recently undergone maintenance and passed all inspections. One retired mechanic hired quietly by Evelyn years later claimed certain damage patterns found in the wreck did not fully match the official explanation given at the time. There were also conflicting witness statements about Alexander's behavior hours before the crash. Some claimed he appeared distracted and frightened. Others reported seeing another vehicle following him shortly before the accident occurred. None of those details were ever seriously pursued by authorities. The case was closed quickly, and the Whitmore family moved forward with the funeral almost immediately. For Evelyn, the days after Alexander's death felt unreal. Friends later described her as emotionally exhausted, isolated, and increasingly afraid inside the mansion. She had barely begun processing the loss of her husband when the atmosphere around her shifted completely. The sympathy she expected from the Whitmore family never came. Instead, suspicion surrounded her almost overnight. Lawyers connected to the Whitmore estate began questioning her involvement in Alexander's financial decisions. Family members quietly suggested she manipulated him into changing his will. Conversations stopped whenever she entered rooms. Staff members who once treated her kindly suddenly avoided eye contact altogether. Then came the restrictions. Evelyn discovered her personal accounts had been frozen without warning. Access to certain areas inside the mansion was removed. One former employee later claimed servants were privately instructed not to speak to her unless absolutely necessary. It was as if the family had already decided she no longer belonged there, even before Alexander Whitmore was buried. The isolation became overwhelming. Pregnant, grieving, and surrounded by hostility, Evelyn began realizing the Whitmores were preparing to remove her completely before she had the chance to understand what was really happening around her. The confrontation finally exploded just days after the funeral. According to accounts from former staff members, Margaret Whitmore summoned Evelyn into the main sitting room late one evening while rain struck the mansion windows outside. Several family lawyers were already present when Evelyn entered. Papers covered the table. Security stood near the hallway entrance. The atmosphere no longer resembled a grieving family. It felt like a private courtroom where the verdict had already been decided before she arrived. Margaret Whitmore reportedly stared at Evelyn for several seconds before speaking. "You were never one of us." That sentence marked the moment everything collapsed completely. The argument that followed could reportedly be heard throughout the mansion. Evelyn accused the family of hiding information connected to Alexander's death. Margaret accused Evelyn of manipulating her son for money. Lawyers interrupted repeatedly, pressuring Evelyn to sign documents connected to inheritance rights and estate control. When she refused, the situation turned vicious. One servant later described seeing a suitcase thrown down the grand staircase, while Evelyn's young child cried near the entrance hall. Rain poured outside the gates as security staff waited nearby. Family members watched from the hallway without intervening. Then, sometime before midnight, Evelyn was forced out of the Whitmore mansion. The doors closed behind her while thunder rolled across the estate, ending her life inside the Whitmore family as suddenly as it had begun. But before leaving the mansion that night, Evelyn did something nobody discovered until many years later. She took something from Alexander Whitmore's private office. Act 5. Then, Evelyn vanished. After the night she was forced out of the Whitmore mansion, it was as if she disappeared from the face of the earth. The newspapers that once followed her marriage to Alexander Whitmore suddenly stopped mentioning her name entirely. Reporters who tried locating her after the funeral found nothing. Her apartment in Manhattan had been emptied. Her phone numbers no longer worked. Even people who once considered themselves close friends admitted years later that they had no idea where she went after leaving the estate that night. It was as though someone wanted Evelyn erased completely from public memory, and for a long time, that was exactly what happened. Rumors spread across New York almost immediately. Some claimed she suffered a breakdown after Alexander's death and quietly checked herself into a psychiatric facility somewhere outside the state. Others believed the Whitmore family paid her to disappear permanently in exchange for silence. There were whispers that she fled the country under a different name. A former journalist who investigated the Whitmores years later claimed someone inside the family intentionally leaked stories portraying Evelyn as unstable, so nobody would take her seriously if she ever spoke publicly about what happened inside the mansion. The longer she remained gone, the more extreme the rumors became. Eventually, some people began believing Evelyn was dead, and for nearly 2 decades, nobody could prove otherwise. But while the Whitmore family rebuilt their image and buried the scandal surrounding Alexander Whitmore's death, Evelyn was quietly rebuilding her life far away from Manhattan. What makes her story remarkable is not simply that she survived after losing everything. It is how carefully she transformed herself without anyone realizing it was happening. According to financial records uncovered years later, Evelyn spent the first several years after leaving the mansion moving constantly between cities while raising her son alone. She worked under temporary contracts, avoided interviews, and kept almost no traceable connection to her past. Every decision appeared deliberate, almost strategic, as if she understood that remaining invisible was the only way to protect herself and her child from the influence of the Whitmore family. At the center of everything was her son. The little boy who cried in her arms the night they were forced out of the mansion grew up knowing almost nothing about the Whitmores. Evelyn never filled his childhood with stories of wealth or revenge. According to people who later knew them personally, she raised him with extraordinary discipline and emotional care despite the struggles they faced privately. They lived modestly during the early years. Evelyn worked constantly while attending business and finance courses at night, slowly developing knowledge most people never expected someone with her background to possess. What began as survival eventually became ambition, and ambition became power. By the time the Whitmore family stopped paying attention to her entirely, Evelyn had already started building something nobody saw coming. Through small investments, consulting work, and eventually private acquisitions, she entered industries connected to real estate and corporate restructuring. Former associates later described her as intensely focused, emotionally controlled, and unusually patient. She avoided publicity, rarely attended public events, and often conducted negotiations through representatives rather than appearing herself. That decision helped protect the one secret nobody could discover. The woman quietly buying pieces of struggling companies across the country was the same woman the Whitmores once threw out of their mansion in disgrace. Years passed, and the transformation became extraordinary. The same family that once treated Evelyn like an outsider had no idea she was slowly becoming wealthier and more influential than many of the people who humiliated her. Corporate offices replaced small apartments. Private meetings replaced restaurant shifts. Financial analysts began noticing a mysterious investor connected to increasingly successful acquisitions, though very few people knew her real identity. And while the Whitmores remained trapped protecting an aging empire built by previous generations, Evelyn built something entirely her own. But despite everything she achieved, there was one truth she kept hidden from her son all those years. He never knew the full story about Alexander Whitmore. Evelyn never told him how powerful the Whitmore family truly was. She never described the humiliation she endured inside the mansion or the accusations that followed Alexander's death. Most importantly, she never explained why they were forced out on that stormy night. According to one former family friend, Evelyn wanted her son to grow up free from hatred and obsession. She feared that if he learned the truth too early, The bitterness surrounding the Whitmore family would consume his life the same way it nearly consumed hers. And for many years, she succeeded in keeping the past buried. Until one phone call changed everything. The phone call came late at night while Evelyn was reviewing documents inside her office overlooking downtown Chicago. According to records connected to the Whitmore estate, the call lasted less than 4 minutes. But whatever was said during that conversation changed the course of everything that followed. The caller was a former employee from the Whitmore mansion, an elderly groundskeeper who had worked for the family for decades before quietly retiring. For years he had remained silent, terrified of the consequences that came with speaking against the Whitmores. But age has a way of changing people. So does guilt. That night, he told Evelyn something she had feared since the moment Alexander Whitmore died. The accident may not have been an accident at all. Over the years, the Whitmore empire had started collapsing under the weight of secrets, greed, and internal conflict. The family that once controlled politicians, investors, and entire industries was no longer untouchable. Financial scandals connected to hidden offshore accounts began surfacing publicly. Several Whitmore business ventures failed after risky investments drained enormous amounts of money from the estate. Lawsuits piled up from former associates accusing family executives of fraud and corruption. One scandal involved missing charitable funds connected to a Whitmore foundation that had spent years presenting itself as a symbol of generosity and influence. Newspapers that once praised the family now questioned whether the Whitmore dynasty was finally dying. And at the center of the collapse was the mansion itself. The estate that once represented wealth and permanence had quietly become a financial burden. Maintenance costs spiraled out of control, while legal disputes tied up family assets. Sections of the property reportedly remained closed because repairs had become too expensive. Former employees described arguments erupting constantly between surviving members of the family over inheritance, control, and money. The unity the Whitmores once projected to the public no longer existed. Family members had started turning against each other. The empire that once destroyed Evelyn was finally falling apart. What nobody inside the Whitmore family realized was that the collapse had created the exact opportunity Evelyn had spent years waiting for. Through a network of hidden shell companies and anonymous acquisitions, she had quietly positioned herself closer to the Whitmore estate than anyone could have imagined. Property shares connected to the mansion were purchased gradually through third parties. Debts tied to the estate were bought silently through corporate intermediaries. Financial leverage shifted piece by piece until the unthinkable finally happened. Evelyn gained controlling ownership of the Whitmore estate. By the time the family understood what had happened, it was already too late. That is why, on that storm-filled night 20 years after she was thrown out, the gates of the Whitmore mansion opened for Evelyn once again. Not as a grieving widow, not as an unwanted outsider, but as the legal owner of everything standing behind those iron gates. Former staff members later described the atmosphere inside the mansion the moment she arrived as almost unreal. The black SUV rolled slowly across the long driveway, while rain hammered the windows of the estate. Several servants reportedly recognized Evelyn immediately despite the passing years. Some froze in disbelief. Others looked genuinely frightened. One former housekeeper later admitted she nearly started crying when she saw Evelyn step out of the vehicle because she remembered the night security forced her into the rain with a child in her arms. This time, Evelyn walked toward the mansion differently. There was no fear in her face anymore. The front doors opened before she even reached the steps. Inside the entrance hall, members of the Whitmore family stood completely frozen as she entered the same home where they once humiliated her and erased her existence. An old portrait of Alexander Whitmore still hung near the staircase, watching over the hallway like a ghost trapped inside the past. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence itself felt heavy enough to break people apart. Then came the revelation that shattered whatever control the Whitmores still believed they had left. Evelyn now legally owned the mansion. According to legal filings connected to the estate, every attempt to challenge the acquisition failed almost immediately. The documents were airtight. The debts had been transferred legally. The ownership structure was valid. After decades of protecting the Whitmore legacy, the family discovered their empire had been taken from them by the very woman they once considered powerless. But the most devastating moment was still coming. Because Evelyn did not return to the mansion simply to reclaim property or seek revenge. She came back searching for the truth about Alexander Whitmore's death. And hidden among old records, sealed files, and documents buried inside Alexander's private office was evidence suggesting he suspected someone wanted him dead long before the accident ever happened. According to papers Alexander secretly left behind, he had become increasingly paranoid during the final weeks of his life. Notes recovered from his office described private arguments with family members over inheritance changes and financial control. One handwritten document referenced concerns about being followed. Another reportedly mentioned problems with his vehicle days before the crash. Most disturbing of all was a file containing maintenance reports connected to Alexander's car. Reports suggesting the vehicle may have been intentionally tampered with before the accident occurred. Someone inside the Whitmore family sabotaged Alexander Whitmore's car. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, one terrifying question returned stronger than ever before. Who killed Alexander Whitmore? The deeper Evelyn dug into the documents Alexander Whitmore left behind, the more horrifying the truth became. At first, the evidence appeared scattered and incomplete, fragments of suspicion buried inside personal notes, financial records, and confidential correspondence Alexander never intended anyone else to see unless something happened to him. But once those pieces were finally connected, the picture became impossible to ignore. Alexander Whitmore had not been afraid of strangers. He had not been worried about business competitors or outside enemies trying to destroy the family empire. The danger had been much closer than that. It was inside the mansion the entire time. According to the hidden records recovered from Alexander's office, the growing conflict surrounding the Whitmore inheritance had become explosive during the final months of his life. Alexander's decision to change his will threatened more than money. It threatened power, control, and the structure that had kept the Whitmore empire operating for generations. If Evelyn and her unborn child inherited major control of the estate, certain members of the family would lose influence permanently. And among all of them, nobody stood to lose more than Alexander's younger brother, Daniel Whitmore. For years, Daniel Whitmore lived in Alexander's shadow. Former associates described him as intelligent but deeply resentful, a man who spent his entire life knowing he would never truly matter while Alexander remained alive. Even though Daniel enjoyed the benefits of the Whitmore name, he was never the chosen heir. Investors trusted Alexander. Their father trusted Alexander. The board trusted Alexander. According to former employees, Daniel often appeared cold and controlled in public, while privately struggling with anger and insecurity that worsened over time. Several witnesses later confirmed the brothers argued repeatedly during the months leading up to Alexander's death, especially after rumors spread that Alexander planned to restructure major portions of the family inheritance. Then came the most devastating discovery of all. Among Alexander's hidden files was evidence linking Daniel Whitmore directly to unauthorized repairs performed on Alexander's vehicle shortly before the crash. Financial transfers connected to a private mechanic appeared inside sealed account records. Security logs placed Daniel near the garage area the night before the accident. One handwritten note from Alexander himself contained a sentence investigators overlooked for years. "If anything happens to me, look at Daniel." That single line shattered whatever remained of the Whitmore family's carefully protected image. The culprit was never a business rival. It was Alexander Whitmore's own brother. The motive was as tragic as it was horrifying. Jealousy, inheritance, fear of losing power. Daniel Whitmore believed Alexander's decisions would permanently push him aside, while giving Evelyn and her child control over the future of the family empire. Everything Daniel spent his life chasing suddenly felt threatened by the very people the Whitmores considered outsiders. And according to the evidence Evelyn uncovered, Daniel decided he would rather destroy the family than lose his place inside it. The Whitmore empire wasn't destroyed by outsiders. It destroyed itself. The final confrontation happened inside the mansion's grand dining room, the same room where Evelyn once sat silently while family members humiliated her for not belonging. Former staff later described the atmosphere that night as unbearable. Rain struck the windows outside while surviving members of the Whitmore family gathered around the massive dining table beneath dim chandelier light. Some looked terrified. Others looked exhausted, like people finally realizing the lies protecting them for decades were collapsing in real time. Then Evelyn walked into the room carrying the documents Alexander Whitmore left behind. For several moments, nobody spoke. Daniel Whitmore reportedly refused to look directly at her while the evidence sat spread across the table between them. According to one former servant who witnessed part of the confrontation from the hallway, Evelyn's voice remained calm the entire time, which somehow made the moment even more devastating. "You spent 20 years trying to erase me." The room fell silent. "Now you'll spend the rest of your lives remembering." Those words marked the true end of the Whitmore family. Authorities reopened the investigation surrounding Alexander Whitmore's death shortly afterward. Media outlets exploded with headlines exposing decades of corruption, manipulation, and hidden conflict inside one of New York's most respected wealthy dynasties. Former employees began speaking publicly. Financial crimes connected to the Whitmore empire surfaced rapidly once fear no longer controlled the people around them. And as the family collapsed under the weight of its own secrets, Evelyn Carter faced one final decision that nobody expected. She did not keep the Whitmore fortune for herself. Even more surprising, neither did her son. After finally learning the truth about his father, the mansion, and the years of suffering his mother endured, Evelyn's son made a choice that stunned everyone connected to the case. Instead of continuing the Whitmore legacy, he rejected it completely. According to legal filings released months later, large portions of the estate were converted into a charitable foundation focused on housing assistance, scholarships, and support programs for struggling families across New York and Pennsylvania. Sections of the mansion itself were transformed into community spaces and transitional housing programs designed to help people rebuild their lives after financial hardship and domestic instability. The mansion that once represented power, cruelty, and emotional control became something entirely different. And in the end, the story of Evelyn revealed something the Whitmore family never understood despite all their wealth. True legacy is not measured by money. It is measured by humanity. In the weeks that followed the collapse of the Whitmore family, the mansion slowly became unrecognizable. Reporters who once crowded outside the gates searching for scandal eventually disappeared. The endless legal battles faded from headlines. Contractors arrived quietly during the early mornings while moving trucks carried away decades of furniture, paintings, and family possessions tied to a legacy built on control and fear. One by one, the old portraits hanging across the mansion walls were removed, including the enormous oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors that had watched over generations of power, betrayal, and silence. Former servants later admitted the mansion felt strangely peaceful for the first time in decades. The tension that once filled every hallway was finally gone. Evelyn spent several of those mornings walking alone through the estate before construction crews arrived. People who saw her during that time described her as calm, though there was still sadness in the way she looked at certain rooms inside the mansion. The library where Alexander Whitmore once sat reading late into the night. The dining room where she was humiliated in front of the family. The staircase where her suitcase crashed against the marble steps 20 years earlier while her child cried beside her. Every corner of the mansion carried memories that could never fully disappear, no matter how much the building changed afterward. Yet somehow, Evelyn remained standing through all of it. According to one former employee, the final Whitmore family portrait was removed just before sunrise on a cold autumn morning. Workers carried it carefully through the entrance hall while Evelyn watched silently from the staircase above. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The painting had once represented the image the Whitmores spent generations protecting: wealth, perfection, power, and legacy. But now it looked different. Smaller somehow. like the illusion holding the family together had finally broken beyond repair. As dawn light slowly filled the mansion windows, Evelyn walked alone through the empty hallway where the story that shaped her life first began. 20 years earlier, she walked through those halls feeling unwanted, judged, and powerless. Now the mansion echoed with silence instead of intimidation. The chandeliers still hung above the marble floors. The walls still carried the weight of history. But the meaning of the place had changed forever. In the end, the mansion became something the Whitmores never were. A home. And maybe that is the part of this story that stays with people the longest. Not the wealth. Not the betrayal. Not even the shocking truth about Alexander Whitmore's death. It is the fact that the woman they tried hardest to destroy became the only person capable of breaking the cycle that destroyed the Whitmore family from within. Evelyn could have chosen revenge alone. Nobody would have blamed her after everything she suffered. But instead, she transformed the symbol of her pain into something capable of helping other people survive theirs. Still, there are questions about this story that continue dividing people even now. Do you think Evelyn planned her revenge from the very beginning after leaving the mansion that night? Would you have forgiven the Whitmore family after everything they did to her? And who do you blame most for Alexander Whitmore's death? Daniel Whitmore for his actions, Margaret Whitmore for the environment she created inside the family, or Alexander himself for waiting too long to confront the people around him? If you enjoy emotional true story style documentaries filled with twists, betrayal, hidden family secrets, and shocking revelations, make sure you subscribe for more stories like this, because the next one might be even more unbelievable. And if you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the billionaire who discovered his maid was secretly living a double life.